great honor and privilege tonight to speak with Nari Ward, who, as you know, is the artist having the wonderful installation of the... And before we begin, I obviously want to thank our hosts, Dakis and Lieta Ioannou, for another amazing... Everybody will receive their payment later, so there's no need to. Now, kidding aside, I do want to say that we are very thankful you're here tonight, and I think now it's a great show of love, because frankly, they could be drinking spritz at the Pirate Bar, and or just swimming at sunset, so I think it's really a great warm embrace that this audience gave you last night and tonight again. And maybe I want to start from there. I want to ask you, you've been to Hydra before, and you've been here for other exhibitions. You've been featured also in other exhibitions here and in Athens. I want to ask you if you have any thought or feeling about what does it feel like to be asked to do this show, or how it felt for you when it happened.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. So I've been maybe 4 times, maybe even 5 times, and mostly for participation in the exhibition for my work in the collection. Can you hear me? Okay. So the idea of doing the Slaughterhouse was really quite a challenge. It was a great opportunity, of course. But I also was thinking what it might mean to do a project in this space, because it's such a strong presence. And it's quite small, you know, it is, and I'm used to doing large installations, so I was thinking, well, what would make sense? So I actually asked if I could come back, because I had been to see prior artists' exhibitions, and it's very different, seeing an artist exhibition and being part of the crowd and excitement. It's very different to come and think about the space as something that you're going to take on. So I asked if I could come back in the off season, and I was fortunate. They said sure, come on up, and I was a little bit stuck. See, I had a lot of different ideas and wasn't committed to any one thing. So I said it'd be good to go and see what it might be in the off season. What I didn't notice in my prior visits was that as you're walking up, there is a little fire station on the right-hand side. And that became the catalyst for me sort of re-entering an earlier body of work that I had started with using fire hose. Because I went to see the fireman. We got a meeting with him. Very generous person, spent a good amount of time with us. And what I noticed was that
only one fireman?
There was only one.
Okay.
I don't know. It might.
That's encouraging.
But I think there's one real 24-hour fireman, and the rest are mostly volunteers. I may be wrong in that, but I keep seeing the same person. But I noticed the one thing that was really interesting formally, which is that all the fire hoses were red, and it's quite particular because in New York, when I've used fire hose, they're mostly gray. So that became the journey of like, oh, I want to use this red material, just on a formal level, and a challenge as well, and figure out what I could possibly do with it, where it would take me. Like I said, I'd worked with fire hose before because I ended up having a studio on 125th Street in Harlem across from a fire department. And they gave me their fire hose. And then I also live in a firehouse. So, you know, I have a lot of fire experience. But the real reason I wanted to use it is that it was a material that readily engaged with the idea of like 2 elements, 2 really major powerful elements, fire and water. And also the act of salvation, like the fireman and this idea of salvation. So that level of storytelling was already inherent in the material. And so I'm telling you about the fire hose to say that the materials really drive, for me, the story of where I want to go. And so that became the catalyst. So the other part of the inspiration, which is actually engaging Dakis, was telling him about what I might think about doing. And I was really thinking, it was about the same time that Jamaica had gone through this catastrophic Hurricane Melissa. So Jamaica was on my mind where I was born. And I started doing research of different things that had happened in the past in Jamaica. And there was this one concert that I was intrigued with. It was called Smile Jamaica that Bob Marley had sung. He did a special concert to bring peace to the two sort of warring factions of political parties. And in that, if you Google or YouTube the concert, the one song that they always talk about is his song War. And Bob Marley's song, the War song, was inspired by Haile Selassie's speech to the United Nations in 1963, where he talked about the need for a kind of global unity and humankind living up to its expectation by having this idea of coming together. So it was a really powerful speech, and it was a speech and Bob Marley incidentally turned it into a speech about the consequences of this not happening. That's why in every refrain he says war. So I was really intrigued with how that speech, especially at this moment in time, could be reactivated and repurposed to think about other possibilities or other consequences. And so the working with somebody, the Afro-Greek community, came up. And then I think Dakis was mentioning that, in Greece, they have their own folk music. And I didn't know about it. He says, Rembetika, right? And so the Rembetika became a kind of an idea to bring that in with the reggae. And for me, it was a new fit. I didn't really know about this music form. But I started researching it, and it made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. It was initially individuals who were marginalized or new refugees that were absorbed back into this society. But it was also, in some ways, a kind of renegade form. It was sort of outlawed, particularly because the use of hashish early on. And same with reggae, it was the use of ganja, marijuana. So I found that there was some symbiosis that was interesting. And the idea of making a mashup of the two forms would make sense. And bringing Haile Selassie's speech into the dialogue really was a fit for the work.
I don't want to delve in stereotypes, but apparently when Selassie went to Jamaica the first time, he spoke about this cloud of ganja smoke because the Rastafarians were welcoming him, and he didn't come out of the airplane, right? He stayed on the...
I think he was a little bit taken back by who these fanatics were. So the idea and the Rastas, Rastafari, saw him as a direct lineage of King Solomon, the Solomonic tribe, so to speak. And so he actually is a line of rulership from that biblical narrative. And so they saw him as this coming of the king, a new king. And so they really worshipped as almost like an image of Christ.
Well, that really struck me too, that he didn't fully deny being Jesus or the Messiah, right, but didn't either embrace it. He kind of played the dance between suggesting that he might be or he might not be.
I think one of the newsreels that I noticed is really powerful, and I think that's what stayed with this group, is an image of the King and Queen of England bowing in front of him, because he was royalty, right? And so I think that's the takeaway they had, and so they felt like he was this all-powerful individual. He was quite short too, so that was interesting.
When you brought up religious yourself?
No, I live next to a church, and that's as religious as I get. There is the Church of the Meek next door, so I don't really have to go to church. I can hear them through the walls. But I grew up as a Baptist, but I sort of walked away from the tenets of religion. But I have a lot of respect for the belief structures around it. I just don't acknowledge the limitations that it might impose on people.
And I want to go back a second to the fire hoses. You mentioned how you were struck by the fact they were red, and obviously you have used fire hoses throughout your career, I think most notably in Amazing Grace, which is a beautiful total installation from '93, which features some 365 strollers bundled with fire hoses, and then in that same year you made Exodus at the Venice Biennale, which has some similarity with this piece, where
Yes.
you have suitcases and objects referring to Exodus and to travel. That
Yeah, there were all objects found in the neighborhood that I wanted to somehow take on a journey, a metaphorical journey. And this idea of transformation that I associated with the fire hose, it made sense that these vessels would be vessels to pack these objects that I would find. And Exodus is also, just by chance, there's not a line of, just by coincidence, was also an album of Bob Marley. But Exodus, in that term, I was thinking about movement, right? The movement of people.
Well, and the Exodus was about the idea of the Rastafarians returning actually to Ethiopia, right?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
But the fire hoses, obviously, in America are immediately seen as also tools of repression against the civil rights movement. And as I was thinking about the conversation tonight, I was also struck by the coincidence that Selassie speaks, I think, in October 1963 at the United Nations, and he speaks about a dream of a future where no race will trample another.
Right.
And a couple of months before, Martin Luther King in Washington is talking about a similar dream, and they both use the word dream, and both those dreams were paradoxically drowned literally with water being sprayed by fire hoses. I don't know actually if you ever spoke about the fire hoses also in that context yourself.
I think it's, in some ways it was in the work, so I didn't, not directly. For me, it was always about this idea of transformation. So I think I stayed. It's sort of like a material that people bring their own thing to. So I didn't want to always dictate what it should be. So I always wanted to leave that open-ended.
And of course, in Greece also, at least to me, and I'm sure to many of you here, the fire hose is a metonymic connection immediately to the fires every summer, which have become more. Was that something also in your mind?
I think that was what really, in talking to the fireman, he was talking about how critical it is, the fire on an island like this, to get to it and to have the resources to take care of it in terms of the water, and the pumps that they need. So there's a real adventure into thinking about other ways of dealing with a crisis. But the crisis element is around the material was also really interesting to consider in terms of the narrative and the layers it might have.
And obviously, Jamaica is an island, and Manhattan is an island, and Hydra is an island. Is there was there anything you were thinking about as approaching?
Not really. I think the one thing that maybe poetically you consider is the prevalence of water, around you, and when something like a fire happens, how do you get to it, and how do you deal with the care of the situation? So I think that might be more, any place where you have a lot of water around, and you think about access to that.
Yeah, and this is the stuff you learn in Italy if you study Greek. That the word nostalgia comes from nostos, which is to travel by sea. So nostalgia is the longing from a travel, but more specifically from a travel by sea, which obviously immediately evokes also the Odyssey and so on. And particularly in the central piece or in the work Exodus and many other pieces of yours that refer to migration or even to the Great Migration or the escape from the south of the United States, there is a fair amount of nostalgia, it seems,
I think it's the idea of the notion of belonging somewhere and the memory of that place that you're no longer connected to. Somebody was telling me that nostalgia is also categorized as early on as a sickness. Mm-hmm. So I'm cautious about using the word too much, but it is something that I consider, especially with the fire hose man, because my choosing of the luggage, the sort of like 20 or 30 year versions of travel suits.
And so the luggage, where does it come from? Here?
So yes, Athens, from Greece, yeah. So, but I really didn't want to use new luggage. It had to, for me, it had to be luggage from another era. For me, it was really about creating that distance for people to, distance in time, for people to consider it a story that happened, but it's also in the presence of the form. It's happening in their moment as well.
Mm-hmm. And actually, this might be the first show that it's also very much locally made, you know, because
I tell you, the space, I kind of dreamed this space for the last several months. Because I wanted to bring in things from the fire hose from the fire department, the anchor from the historic museum just down the way, and how to activate those things that people are going to walk by and then reimagine or re-experience when they walk into the space. So that was really key. No pun intended with the key in the piece, but that was a real major element of the work, to bring the familiar and then have it become immediately strange and poetic.
And those keys, where do they come from?
So the key was a really interesting, you know, I had this Jamaican friend who lives in my neighborhood in Harlem, and he's a locksmith. So Steve, the locksmith, I asked Steve, you know, can I get some keys? I'm working on a project. And every day he would say, I have your keys, I have your keys. And I couldn't find them, you know. And so I finally cornered him and I said, you know, I need these keys, I have to get the work done. And he came out with...
That's how I feel about artists every day, you realize that.
This term, herding cats, right? So he brought this entire bucket of keys, more than I thought I would ever need. And so it was a good problem to have this many keys. And the keys for me was really this idea of access, right? So it's a very straightforward symbol. And also, I guess in another way, it was this moment of bringing an intimate object into the conversation, an object that people are familiar with as a kind of something in their hand that is talking about, you know, entry. So I really thought I would use, you know, a few of them, but then my dealing with anxiety around the project is just to do the same thing over and over and over. Like the work and the repetition becomes almost a kind of mantra for me to soothe the anxiety around creating of the work and the place that it's trying to experience.
Yeah, I'll say this, which I should never say, but I was speaking with the great team, Regina, Eugenia, and the whole DESTE team. They should get a round of applause. No, I'm going to share too much. I was saying that you are a falsely relaxed artist. You know, you project an image of being chilled, but you are very exacting and a little bit stressed, even though it doesn't look like it. But
I mean, people said, "Oh, how is Hydra here?" And you know, basically, it was, you know, going from the slaughterhouse, getting something to eat, going to bed, washing up, going back to the slaughterhouse. It was really just that rhythm, and I needed that rhythm to focus. And so I ate well, of course, and I slept well, and I bathed well. But it was definitely the focus of the work. The entire time I was here, and the team was amazing. I have to give a shout out to the team. You know, they were incredible to work with, the DESTE team. So they made that part easy as well. Yeah. And my I also have to give a shout out to my assistant. You know, Tyler, TCB, or Tyler Christopher Brown. He was amazing to work with, and he held it down while he was here.
But that is something that then. Is incorporated in the object, I think. Now, particularly if you look at the flags, I don't know if many of you have observed them carefully. You know, there is this knotting, which is
in all the object, it's just mad repetition. You know, no, because for me, it's bringing the energy of labor into the transformation of the work. So people are out asking me, what's inside the luggage, and what's actually inside the luggage is the work of making the piece. In my head, that's kind of. Because the transformation and the physicality of the piece is amplified by this gesture of its basically it's concealment, right? This opacity of what it actually is inside.
Yeah, but then they become like batteries in a way, no? Because they are charged by your presence and your. Since we are, thanking the teams, this piece maybe more than others, or as some of your more recent ones, is quite open to the collaboration with others, and more specifically musicians, as we have seen yesterday. Do you want to tell us a little bit how, because yesterday we saw the speakers, but the speakers yesterday were not yet playing the music, because the music was being played live.
Yeah, that's a really important part. So the same way Bob Marley took the song and made it his own, the speech and made it his own, I wanted to figure out how to inspire a musician to take the text, Hydra text, and make it their own. And so I was, DESTE put me in touch with a wonderful musician, Angelo. So he sings Rebecca. He's an Afro-Greek performer. And so he really helped guide the musical aspect of composing that part. I didn't expect him to, but he asked me to put my voice or read the speech to him. I thought he just wanted to hear the speech. But he ended up using my voice in his composition, which is terrifying to me every time I hear it. You know when you hear yourself, you can't believe that's how you sound. But I was really happy with how it came out. And the one thing I was really interesting, his interpretation of Haile Selassie's speech. It's really about trying to bring, not just copying it, but bring his experience, his own experience into it.
And when you told me about that aspect of the project and how you were also interested in Afro-Greek culture, immediately I thought of a rather now controversial or disputed book, which is Black Athena by Martin Bernal, which is this, I'm sure many of you have known, is this kind of archaeological treaty, perhaps a little too fantastical or too less scientifically grounded than one would hope, in which he retraces what he calls the Afro-Asian roots of classical Greece. And I don't know if any of those thinking, and basically the general argument is the way in which we imagine classical Greece has too much to do with the interpretation that was actually created later, mainly in the 19th century, and that we should actually rethink classical Greece as being closer to the East and closer to Egypt and closer to Asia Minor and to Africa than when we typically think. So this process of this project?
I think it maybe have to consider the fact that we create these pockets of history, and in fact, it's human nature is to sort of come together, right? The governments and borders are imposed, but we always find a way to cross over, right? And I think that's been from day one, And I never really, the Martin Bernal text the criticism is valid, but I always felt like, we're all Africans anyway. We all come from, if you trace us all the way back, it's all coming from, we're all coming from Africa. So if you look at it that way, it's a fresher view to consider history. If you look at human history in that way, you can actually, you're more empathetic to see how decisions were made by government that had nothing to do with who we are, our very nature. Science can tell us that this is where human beings came from. So we're all Africans. So that's good to know.
Yeah, and there is an Italian writer, Giorgio Manganelli, that he was speaking about Rome, but I think it's quite inspiring to apply it to Athens or to Greece. He says that we always assume Rome or Athens would be the first city of the West. And he says, I think at one point in their own history, they felt like the last great city of the East, like after Nineveh, after Babylon. And I think that's also beautiful if you walk around Athens to feel its proximity to Alexandria maybe than to Rome, and even to think of Rome being closer to to Alexandria than vice versa. But in your conversations with Angelo, what's his take on?
I think,
and is he here or did he left?
No, I think he's here, but I don't think he was really, the title for his, and I'm projecting this because we haven't got a chance to really sit down, and we will later, but his title for the composition is Fleeting Illusion, right? Which is a phrase from the speech, right? The idea that if humanity doesn't come to terms with embracing each other, that the idea of peace will be a fleeting illusion, and so that's what his title was. And I think this fleeting illusion is really the premise for considering. I actually was really fascinated that he titled his composition Fleeting Illusion, because I thought that said a lot. That it really spoke about, because my title for the piece is, as you know, is Until That Day, right? Which is a kind of hopeful gesture of thinking, okay, things will happen. And his composition he put as Fleeting Illusion. So I felt like the Fleeting Illusion narrative is valid, right? It sort of makes sense. And the consequences of the Fleeting Illusion might be Bob Marley's part, which is war.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, I was just contemplating that maybe the idea of a fleeting illusion might be justifiable and maybe sustainable, even if it's problematic. But war is even more problematic.
And actually, I mean, not to put you on the spot or ask you to interpret what Bob Marley was saying, but today I was rereading the lyrics to the song. And it is also a call to arms, no? I mean, at least there are some. Sometimes he says it is war, meaning
it's really a warning, right?
But also sometimes I think he's saying, guys, we gotta get this done. You know, I don't know. Does he read to you that way, or do you think it's a call to war?
I think it's a call to.
I think it's one of his less peaceful songs ever, no?
But he, again, he was negotiating a market, right? Like he is an entertainer. He's not an activist, right? So he was using an art form to talk about resistance. I don't think he was trying to get people he was trying to get people to think about what was going on and really establishing this warning, which I think is what the project is about. It's really how do we re-enter this idea of thinking. When the consequences is war, how do we get back to the possibility space, right? And I think that idea of possibility is what, when people come together and ask questions and look at each other in the face and ask questions about what they think or where they were when they heard war, what this might mean now, those kinds of dialogue, I think, are necessary still.
Now, this is a very banal question. Why there is a telephone?
So it's a very personal piece. When I was working on the project, this piece came first, and it's really about this idea of communication, which is so essential in any negotiation of peace or compassion, whatever, empathy. So in the starting point, material is always the key for me. So in the bottles, there's these little scribbles on paper. And my aunt was autistic, and so she actually did those. She did those for hours, and she took care of my brother and myself when my mom went to the States. So for about 3 or 4 years, she was our caretaker, but she never really was able to express her ideas or talk to us. But she had this habit of sitting there for hours making these scribbles or writing letters. Then she would secretly fold them up and pass them along to us. And so I had hundreds of these. My brothers and I have hundreds of them. We didn't know what to do.
It was like a message.
It was a message that all the things that she couldn't say, right? And so I wanted to use these in some way, display them. And so the idea of the message in the bottle, her desire to connect and communicate. It's called Distant Sound, the piece. So it made perfect sense when I was thinking about the sea being right there, and the bed springs, the symbol. The bed spring itself is a concentric circle, so it's sort of holding the bottles in place. So that was for me, it was about this notion of communication is so essential. And the lack of communication, the breakdown of communication.
And so the piece actually contains your own drawings?
Yes,
Oh.
yeah. In the bottles are her scribbles. And over time, you know, this happened, this an anecdote, this is kind of funny, that the museum, I had done a larger version of a bottle piece dedicated to her work, where I put a hanging bottle curtain piece that the Luxembourg Museum purchased. And for days, for years, they would have it in this brand new IMP building. There's a glass atrium. And it's the only thing that could go in that atrium, because all the other sculptures, you know, the weather, the light, sunlight would take away, would somehow affect it. But then they realized that the ink was disappearing, the ink from because of the sunlight. And they called me and said, "What do we do? This ink is disappearing. Should we take it all out and you know, conserve it?" I said, "No, that's great." And they let it disappear, and I thought that was beautiful. That her writing would just kind of evaporate, you know, but the letters would be intact.
And the bed springs. Oops, I don't know. The bed springs you have used before,
Yes.
and interesting enough, now you don't see it anymore in Hydra, but they were also a presence in Hydra that people use them to make fences, no? And even on the walk to the slaughterhouse, you would find them abandoned on that hill. And where does that come from?
I think in Jamaica you see that as well, the bed springs. Yeah. You know, I did a piece with Ralph Lemon, a collaboration with the dancer choreographer Ralph Lemon, and he asked me to do something for the stage. And of course, being an artist, I wanted to keep it real. I didn't want to create another kind of space for him. It wasn't about creating a fiction. So I decided I wanted to do something with the idea of curtains. So I made these bed spring curtains. So, you know, it's a stage, so I wanted to reference the stage in that way. And so it became this a way to create a boundary that was physical but not visual. Mm-hmm. And again, I like the fact that it was just a repetition of these spirals that, and thinking about sleep and the amount of time we spend sleep in the space of the unconscious, I felt like it was a really interesting space to explore.
And the domino, how does that?
So dominoes, yeah. You know, the one thing that I realized that I wanted people to spend time in the space, right? Like, and around the space. I didn't want to just come in, yeah, good, and leave. That may happen anyway, but I also wanted to give them the option of actually sitting down and being there, right? And so I remember growing up in Jamaica, dominoes was what everybody played. They'd come around, have dominoes, and spend hours talking and playing dominoes. And so I decided that the domino would be really the thing to keep them there. So there's these, and my wink and nod to the project was that they're actually scorched tables. So the tables are kind of burnt in a sort of Japanese style of preserving wood. So the fire is now being used not to destroy, but also to protect in that case. And so that felt right for the project.
And early on, you were also saying they could go on the wall, like a...
Yeah, I shied away from that because then, I was talking about painting, and I didn't want to paraphrase painting in that space. I felt like they should just become the furniture that they wanted to be. The idea was really to activate the entire slaughterhouse. So not only the figure in the middle, the fire hose man, but then you see the fire hose on the floor, so that you become part of the luggage in a sense when you walk in there, right? Because you're now part of what's happening with this figure that you're witnessing.
And the fountain, I think you might be the first artist who makes a fountain there with the...
Yeah, the anchor. The anchor was a really great accident because we got the scale of the anchor totally wrong, and it was initially supposed to fit into the slaughterhouse next to the fire hose man, and it wasn't going to work. So we decided to move it out, and it was the best place to move it onto the terrace. And it was always supposed to have a dialogue with the sea, because the firemen use the sea when they're. So I really wanted to use their technology of the pump to bring the seawater to the viewer. So it worked even better because you actually could trace the line of red to the sea and come up to the anchor itself. The thing that's really important with the keys if you look, there are keys on the anchor. And it was I nailed all those keys on the anchor. It was really a nod and a wink to one of my former teachers, Jack Whitten, who did these amazing nail pieces. And so,
he loved Greece.
Yeah, and he was always coming to Greece. And in Greece, that's what he would do. He wouldn't paint in Greece. He'd make these like Congo power figures with, you know, just intense labor of nails. And I always thought they were really magical. And he unfortunately never showed them while he was alive. We ended up experiencing that after he passed. But I really wanted that piece to sort of be in dialogue with his spirit.
But now that you say that, in photos of his house, is there an anchor in the center of the courtyard? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, no, I know there's a tree, but I don't know.
Oh, it's a tree, not an anchor.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like an olive tree.
yeah,
or
exactly.
And maybe this is my last question, and then we see if the audience has any. But has the fireman seen the show, and what has he said?
Oh, I don't know. I'd love to know if he comes up and sees it, and I'd like to, you know. Yeah, I saw him, and he was quite happy that I was back, and he said he would come. You know, I'm sure he has a lot of things to do.
Yesterday, I think we had the first visit from 2 priests, which I thought
I saw that.
we are going mainstream.
I felt blessed. I felt really blessed.
And the beauty is they look like a Piero della Francesca, exactly. So, anyway, thank you, Nari. This was wonderful.
Thank you, guys.